7 of my college friends and I went on a backpacking trip with 2 more experienced guides. We took a car to Zaleski State Forest, which is in the Ohio Appalachians. Early April was the month of the trip, and even though spring was here, the plants and trees were still brown and dead. Promper. Gimpin. There were hills and thick forests all around us. After hiking for a few miles through the forest, we set up camp at a backpacking spot. Along with us, there were a few other groups, such as 2 college-aged girls and a nice older couple. The camps were spread out and ours was set up farther away from the others. I can always feel the energy of a place, but this energy felt different. Everyone had a small tent that could fit 1 person, so we set them up close together to stay safe. Since my tent was at the very back of the group, there was nothing but forest behind me. The campsite was just a big, empty space cut out of the thick forest. We set up our tent right next to the tree line. There were tall, dark trees all around us that cast shadows on the spot and made it feel even stranger. Now let's go back to around 2 a.m. When I woke up, I could hear leaves crunching right behind my tent. I was sound asleep. I heard steps going around and around my tent. There was something on 2 legs, and the steps didn't sound like they came from a rabbit or a dog. This thing walked slowly up to the sides of my tent and around it for a long time. I'm not making this up. It stopped for a while and then continued walking around the rest of our tents. It was breathing like a person whenever it got close to my tent. It felt soft, but heavy, like it was having trouble breathing. I was scared to tears and couldn't open my tent to see what was outside. It felt like hours went by during this. I thought nothing of it until I saw a light shining through my tent. It was hard to tell what it was, but it looked like a shape and was almost shining. Everything was zipped up, so I couldn't see anything well. The light was warm and steady, not flashing like a torch. I was scared to death. I was shocked to see that it was an animal. I finally fell asleep because I was so tired, but I could still hear the heavy footsteps until I finally drifted off. When I asked the others in the morning if they had heard anything, my guide told me that she had too, along with the others. That was really strange, she said. If she wasn't so tired, she would have looked into it. It was also seen by one of the boys in the group, but he thought it was someone else's light, like from another camper. But that night, none of us in the group went to the bathroom or turned on any lights. Something felt really off, and I couldn't shake it. People have told me that the Appalachians are creepy and strange, and that strange things happen there. Now I really believe it. It was late November about 3 years ago, and my husband and I still feel uncomfortable about it. We lived in Seattle at the time and often went surfing on the weekends. We liked going to Nia Bay or Westport because it was a long drive but had great waves. The surf report for this weekend, though, wasn't good. Stormy weather and rough waves along the coast. We were let down but kept looking for other places to surf in the hopes of finding one that was a little safer. Instead, we chose to check out some spots along the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The land next to the strait is lovely, but it's very far away. It can only be reached by car along Highway 112, which goes from Port Angeles to Nia Bay. Along Highway 112 there are only a few small towns and almost no cell service. We chose to go surfing at Twin, a spot along the strait. We were comfortable with the area because we had surfed there before. We thought it would be best to drive out the night before and sleep in our cars so we would be ready for dawn. The surf report said the best waves would be early in the morning. It was cold because it was late November, and we didn't want to pay extra for a spot close by. Instead, we decided to park our car along the beach at Twin in the hopes of a quiet, peaceful night by the water. We thought there would be no one else there, and we were right. We got there around 3:30 p.m., and the only other people parked nearby were a young couple in a camper van. Nothing strange happened between then and 7 p.m. After parking, we cooked dinner, and I went for a short walk on the beach. Just before sunset, the only odd thing happened. After hearing a loud whistle sound, we saw a man walking down the road that leads to the beach. His path along the highway was strange because there was nothing close. Most of the highway is empty, and there are no places to walk or stop. Not many people use this route. My husband and I thought it was very strange and a little scary. He walked along the beach and said hello to the young couple. They asked him to join them around their campfire for a while. My husband and I went to bed around 8 p.m. that night, which was the last time we saw them. I woke up after about an hour and opened the car door a bit to let some fresh air in. The young couple's camper van was gone, which made me feel a little uncomfortable for some reason. It seemed odd because we had seen them sitting by their campfire not long before. I couldn't put my finger on why I felt that way, so I thought it was because I was tired and tried to calm down. When I woke up again, it was almost 11 p.m. I woke up this time so quickly that I woke up my husband as well. I told him I just woke up out of the blue when he asked what was wrong. After going back to sleep, he seemed relaxed, but I stayed awake for about 15 minutes to hear anything. I think my gut was telling me something wasn't right when I looked back. I laid back down and tried to sleep again since I hadn't heard anything. I woke up again after about 20 minutes to find that my husband was already awake. He did nothing but sit there and listen to something outside. I didn't like how quiet and still he was, so I turned on the car lights and asked him what was wrong. He spoke quietly. There were taps on the windows. I remember being very scared at that very moment. After a few hours, when I woke up again, the young couple in the camper van was gone. I told my husband there were no other campers here. We put our shoes on quickly, grabbed flashlights and pepper spray, and then opened the car doors. It was very quiet and dark everywhere. My husband went to check out the trees behind us while I stayed by the car and shone my flashlight on the beach. Since I didn't see anyone, I sat on the back bumper while he looked around. After about 2 minutes, my husband came back quickly walking. A car was parked by the road that leads out. The engine was running, and the lights were off. In less than a minute, we threw everything from the front seats into the back seats, turned on the car, and drove back up the drive-through. We tried to get out of there as quickly as possible, but my husband got lost and went down the highway toward Nia Bay the wrong way. As we went the wrong way, we came across the exit road and were shocked to see the car again, this time with its headlights on. We both felt like time slowed down as we saw it speed up behind us and get closer. As we became more aware that we weren't imagining things, the stress grew. We were really being followed. On one side of the street was a forest and on the other was the ocean. We were lucky to see a small turnout ahead of us and we quickly turned the car left. The car behind us didn't slow down when we made the sharp left turn. It just kept going down the highway in the same direction. We sped up and went about 90 miles per hour to get back to Port Angeles as quickly as possible. It was tense the whole way back, but no one followed us the rest of the way. I always felt like I was being watched and chased. I'm still very scared when I think about who was in that car and what they were trying to do. That was my last summer camp. It was called Camp Catan, and it was on about 50 acres next to a school. I was 11 or 12 years old. Each year group had their own wooden cabin. There were lakes, swimming pools, hiking trails, and open areas for sports. We learned new things like how to boat and shoot an arrow while swimming and playing games during the day. They hired a bigger place farther south of Atlanta once or twice a year. For the bigger kids, this was where we would have sleepovers with campfires and fun things to do outside. I did it with my friends the year before and had a great time. We talked and laughed late into the night while sitting on the cold concrete slab next to a creek. From there you could see 20 or 30 miles of old farms with lots of small trees and wild plants growing on it. The camp leaders, who were usually between the ages of 18 and 20, were pretty chill. They weren't too worried about following the rules. We were free to sleep in, and breakfast or roll call didn't happen until around noon. We played games, went on walks, and just hung out all day. After that, around 4 p.m., we would pack up and go back to the main camp. Not to this time, though. My 3 friends and I planned to sneak out early, just after dawn, before the camp workers got up. We wanted to check out the farmlands that they don't let us play in very often. We had planned ahead and brought warm clothes and extra food. We quietly left as soon as we woke up. When we got to the end of the campground, we crossed the small creek that split it from the wild farmlands. There were broken gates and overgrown plants in the area we went into, which made it feel very old. There was old barbed wire fencing all the way across the hills. Trees had grown right through it and around the wire in some places. We chose to stay with turf for as long as we could because we knew it would help us get back to the camp. The stream stopped running after about a mile, though, and the scenery changed completely. After the wild fir trees, there were neat rows of corn, and it looked like our path was gone. But as the sun came up and our joy pushed us forward, we kept walking up a small hill that showed up in front of us. As we got to the top of the hill, a man in overalls and a wide cap saw us. It was clear that he was a farmer. He looked shocked, but we were too far away for him to see us or ask what we were doing, so when he called out, we ran away quickly. After going another mile through the tall cornfields, the land changed again, and it looked like the edges were clear. I saw what looked like a natural gate made of corn stalks curved into an arch. A small brook ran behind the arch. It was bordered by tall oak trees and looked as pretty as a picture in a book. We went on because we were sure we were going straight and would be able to get back. Our clock showed that it had only been an hour and a half. The land changed into a steep, rocky climb for the next mile or two after that quiet spot. There were lots of sharp thorns, trails that wound around, and no clear way to move forward. We talked about whether to turn around and got scratched by bushes on the way to a big valley. It was weird to see strange plants growing there, arranged in a way that didn't make sense and leading us further down. The tree's bark had flaked off and landed on the ground, showing a smooth, white, pasty surface. The tree's branches were long and thin. The blood-red leaves of the trees were the most interesting thing about them. The valley didn't have any green. It had a lot of moss, and the air smelled damp. We lost track of time as we went along the line of trees deep into the valley. Near the very bottom of the valley, where there were only trees, we found a Victorian-style house with 3 stories. But just as we saw the house, it started to rain hard, making the valley very muddy. Even from far away, the house looked old and worn. Years of rain and rot had made it sag. It was made of wood all the way through, with only a few single-pane glass windows that were still whole. Part of the house that wasn't made of wood was the part that held up the stairs that led inside. The door was wide open. We felt stupid for going inside, but wet fools like places that might be dry. Once we knew where we were, we planned to turn around and go back to camp without telling anyone. I was the first person in the house, because I was in charge of our group. When I put my foot on the first step, it felt hollow and weak, but it could still support my weight. The front door was about 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, and behind us was a long stairwell that went up to the 2nd and 3rd floors. We could see clear holes in the 2nd floor that led to dark places. The big windows in front of the house lit up the stairs, though. Even though the door was open, the sound of water was loud and clear. The house was dark and smelled like mold and dampness outside the area lit by the open door. We stopped for a moment to rest, and I took my guide out of my pack. The noise came from somewhere on top of the house, if it still had one. It sounded like wind and rain. I was checking our snacks at the time. Then I heard the most thunderous footsteps I've ever heard going down the stairs. As soon as my friends heard the sound, they ran. I thought about it for a moment. You could see about 2/3 of the way up the stairs, but there was nothing there. I slammed the door behind me as I jumped out and grabbed my bag. When I touched the wet wood, it felt like wet paper instead of old wood. When I took the last step, It broke under me, and pieces flew all over the place. It rained as I ran up the hill after my friends. There was a loud sound behind me as I ran. The door was being kicked up. It shook the whole valley. I barely remember the trip back, but I do remember that we got to camp around 2 p.m. and ate a late, shaky breakfast or lunch. When I was 12 to 16, I was a scout, and one of our favorite places to camp was Larch Hill in the Wicklow Mountains. There were thick woods and hills all around the campsite, which made it look nice, but also a little scary at night. Around the campfire, the scout leaders liked to tell us scary stories. One of the most popular ones was about the Lady of Larch Hill, a woman who was said to haunt the area. People said she went out in the woods at night looking for someone or something. At the time, I didn't really believe the stories. I thought they were made up. Now, let me talk a bit about how the area is set up. You can park your car in a big dirt area when you get to the campsite. There is a welcome center and bathrooms on the right. There is a gravel road straight ahead. 2 fields can be reached from either side of it. We set up camp in the field in the back for this trip. Outside of the welcome center and by the bathrooms, there were no lights at the campsite. The parking area was lit up by those 2 places. We camped in the back field that weekend. There was a mess tent set up near the field's entrance, which led to the way to the parking area. The mess room was set up near the path that led into the field, and our tents were spread out. This door led to the gravel road that went all the way back to the parking area. When the sun went down, our flashlights, or the campfire, were the only sources of light. It was pretty creepy. Mountain views could be seen from the field, and our tents were at the bottom of the field to the left of the dinner tent. There were trees and bushes all around one side. There were a few boys' tents set up around us, and 4 girls were camping in 2 small tents. My best friend and I were sharing a tent, and earlier that night we got into a fight over something small. There wasn't much going on, but I didn't want to walk around the area by myself because it was so dark. The bathroom and parking lot were the only places with light. It was completely dark everywhere else. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, I asked her to go to the bathroom with me. They were a 5-minute walk from our campsite, and I didn't want to go by myself. She walked ahead about 6 feet and didn't talk to me. Since there was only one light outside the mess room, we didn't use any flashlights and just walked toward it, letting the dim light guide us. As we walked, I kept my eyes on the ground so I wouldn't trip over tree roots or any camping gear that might have been left out for the next morning. Then, I saw a girl's shadow about 3 feet behind me to my left. I believed that one of the other girls had heard us leave, and was also afraid to go to the bathroom by herself at night. I turned around, but no one was there. The shadow was still there when I looked down, though. I was sure it was a girl's shadow because I could see long hair and what looked like a dress. First, I saw my own shadow, then the shadow of my friend, and finally the shadow next to me. I saw something strange. What was that light coming from? It was the only light on that cloudy night when you couldn't see the moon or the stars. My shadow and my friend's shadow went from where we were standing to 10 o'clock, but this other shadow came out of nowhere. I tried to figure out what the shadow could be, but I was too scared to think of anything. So I closed my eyes and walked toward my friend. Along the way, we didn't say a word. The only sounds were our feet on the dirt and the leaves rustling in the trees. The path was clear after we passed the mess tent. We both turned on our phone flashlights to help us see. As we walked, I got a chill down my spine and hoped that nothing would jump out at us from the dark. There were lights from other campers all over the area, but none of them were bright enough or close enough to help us see our way. When we got to the bathrooms, I shut myself in a stall and did nothing. I didn't leave until I heard my friend flush and open her stall. I was afraid to look in the mirror while I washed my hands for fear of seeing something I didn't want to see. We then walked back to our tent, and I went straight into my sleeping bag without saying a word. I was too scared to talk, but I could hear my friend moving. That night, I didn't get much sleep because I was stuck on what had happened and whether I had seen a ghost. Up until now, people often ask me if I've ever seen or felt something supernatural. When they do, I remember that shadow walking behind me. My 2-year-old brother and I have always gone camping together. There are a lot of hours we've spent together in the woods making forts and BMX tracks, hunting, and just exploring. We've been taking trips across the U.S. since 2016, whenever we have time off to explore deep caves, hike through mountains, and even climb cliffs. When he's with me, I wouldn't do or be afraid of anything. I think that's very important to say. We could both tell that this time was different. There have been many fun times and stories to tell, but this one has stuck with me like a ghost. It was 2019, and we were both in our mid-20s. I think it was my 5th time hunting in this area, but it was my first time with my brother. There are only a few rough county roads through the huge forest. The rest are wide, 2-track trails that go on for miles. We put all of our things into my truck, including 3 tents, one for each of us to sleep in, and one to change clothes and store our stuff. There were thick trees and brush on both sides of the long drive through the forest paths. It was rough and windy on the roads. The nearest big road was about 8 to 10 miles away, so we were pretty much in the middle of nowhere. After a long trip, we got there late at night, set up camp, and went to sleep. We did some scouting and tracking the next day, and then we went back to camp for the night. We made dinner, ate it, drank some drinks, and talked for a while. Even though it was still early, we went to sleep because it had been a long day. Things had been going smoothly up until that point. All of a sudden, I woke up to the sound of something hitting my tent. My brother was then calling my name. I knew something was wrong right away. When I called to him again, he quickly opened my tent and walked inside. He looked really scared to me. If I asked him what was wrong, he would grab my arm and whisper, "Shh." It was likely around 4:30 or 5 in the morning since the sun hadn't risen yet. Inside my tent, we sat there quietly, trying to figure out what was going on. Then, we heard it. That sound that still makes no sense to me. The sound I can best describe is the laughter of a woman, but the tones were different, like they were coming from a long way away. There would only be a few seconds of quiet between each sound. Then it went from high-pitched squeals to very low sounds that made the ground shake. I feel bad that I didn't record it with my phone at the time because I wasn't ready to think about it. The strange sounds didn't stop until the first rays of light came up. I think it was about an hour long, but I'm not sure. We both kept quiet. I thought I could almost feel the energy around me, like static electricity was all over my body, if that makes sense. It began to rain a few minutes after the sound stopped, and then one of the craziest thunderstorms I've ever seen while camping hit. Before we left on our trip, the weather report for the days we'd be there didn't say anything about rain. But when it rained, all the stakes that held our tent and tools in place were pulled out of the ground. A lot of the poles in both of our tents were also pulled out. With an axe, we drove those stakes deep into the ground, and it would have taken a lot of force to pull even one of them out. My brother won't talk about it, and says it was just some tools being pulled. Not at that time, though. We were both scared and unsettled. We were so far from any towns or companies that it seemed odd that it was still the middle of the night. Still, we heard and felt something like that. Strange things have happened to me before, but I can't understand this one. I live in northeast Georgia near the foothills of the Appalachians. There are many miles of national forest in this beautiful area, along with state parks and great places to camp. I love going for walks with my dog on these roads. It's a little scary, though, because the woods are sometimes quiet and far away from civilization. I'm about 10 miles from town, and there are no cell phones or houses for miles around. I feel like I can't get help if I need it. Many cars have been broken into at the trailheads in the past. To keep my things safe, I always lock my car and take them with me. I think the broken glass is from car windows because it sparkles in the gravel parking lots at some trailheads. There are also times when Shady people hang out in these places or drive on Forest Service roads. These roads are very rough, and you'll often see old, beat-up cars going too fast on trails that are meant for 4x4s. Some of the people in the cars look like the guy from Breaking Bad who was hit by an ATM. You should still be careful, but it's a great place to camp. 2 of my friends and I chose to play paintball in the National Forest a few years ago. We thought it would be fun to sleep out instead of heading home after playing paintball, so we could play again the next morning. After playing paintball with each other for most of the day, we drove a few miles to one of the more famous places to camp. However, there were no spots left because a church group had already taken them all. It was getting late, and this was the only place we knew of to camp. It was still dark, so we drove deeper into the trees for about an hour. It was getting darker, and we were beginning to worry about where to camp. All of us had GPS on our phones, but none of us could use it. We ended up on a road we didn't know, and that wasn't in great shape. It looked like Forest Service rangers had used a backhoe to block the road with a pile of dirt. It looked like 4x4s had gone over the hill, though, so it was worn down. We chose to go over the hill because our F-150 had good ground clearance. After crossing, we came across an old dirt road that was mostly free of trash. We went down this road for a few miles until we found a clearing next to a small creek. There were blue tarps hanging over a wooden table that was attached to a tree. It looked a little odd. We didn't want to drive around all night looking for a place to camp because it was getting dark. The truck lights were still on when we set up the tent. There was a lot of trash in the woods around the spot while we were setting up the tent. I looked down and saw a green bottle on the ground. The label told me it was a bottle of bug spray for the house and yard. I was very tired, so I just thought someone had been throwing trash here. But none of us thought it was strange that someone would throw trash in a place more than an hour from the closest house. We made camp and made our own soup. It was likely around 11 o'clock by this point. As we ate, we saw a dim light coming from the other side of a nearby hill. We first thought it was the moonlight shining through the trees. That being said, the views didn't make sense. It wasn't moving and didn't look like a bright light. It looked like the glow you see over a big city. We couldn't tell where the light was coming from, though. We knew it wasn't other campers because there were no other access roads close. We chose to go check out the hill since it was only a quarter mile from our campsite. Normally, I wouldn't have done that, but we had all had a few rum and cokes. Jacob and I took a look while Isaac, my other friend, chose to stay behind and cook popcorn over the fire. We walked in the direction of the light. It got even stranger after that. The bark on all the trees in the area was ripped off in a circle around their roots. It looked like a beaver from the creek, but it didn't make sense for a beaver to go around all these trees and just knock the bark off one after the other. Most likely because we were drunk, Jacob and I began talking loudly about the ghost beaver. We were almost at the top of the hill when Jacob tripped and yelled, "Oh, shht!" The light, or whatever it was, went out a short time after he yelled. We shook our heads and thought that maybe we didn't need to find out what the light was after all. We looked back every few seconds as we walked back in quiet. We chose to turn off the flashlight and walk back to the tent by the light of the moon. As we got a few dozen feet away from the campfire, I saw my other friend Isaac moving around. He was wearing a covered coat that I had never seen him wear before. He also had his paintball gear in his hand, which we thought was a little odd. We couldn't see our campsite very well because the fire had gone out, and Isaac looked like he was looking for something from afar. He kept looking into the tent as he walked around the area. We saw Isaac walking up the road we came in on when we were almost back. We waited for Isaac by the fire because we thought he was going to the bathroom. Then, all of a sudden, we saw him stumble out of the tent and throw up while saying that he'd had a few more drinks. When we asked him why he was on the move with the paintball gear, he just gave us a strange look and said it wasn't him because the gear was locked up in the truck. We went to check the truck, put in the door code, and all of our paintball gear was still there. The keys were still hidden below in a magnetic fob. I had a bad feeling in my stomach. "Isaac, what did you do when we left?" I asked. "I think I fell asleep while watching a movie on my phone," he said. "But you had your paintball gear on while you were out and about, right? Did you change your coats too?" I asked again. Isaac then told us that he had been in the tent all night and had been wearing the same fleece. Someone who wasn't Isaac had been walking around our spot. We were all too drunk to drive at this point, but we chose to leave and spend the night at my house. We didn't stop to fold up the tent because the sleeping bags and other things were already inside. We got into the F-150, and I began to drive away. When we got to the dirt mound, we saw something gray in our way. The metal fence that had been lying in the woods before was back on its stand and sitting on top of the mound. None of us wanted to get out of the car and try to move the block. The front of my F-150 had a metal guard on it, so I slowly moved forward and lightly tapped the metal barrier with the truck girl. I worried that it would blow out one of the truck's tires, but it didn't. A car without its lights on was following us down the road. Though it was about 1,000 feet behind us, we could see it every so often, because the moonlight bounced off of it. On the Forest Service road, I sped up as much as I could, and the other car kept up with us. We finally got back to the main paved road after going very fast on the dirt roads for about 45 minutes. Just to be safe, I changed my mind about the way I was going to take everyone back to my house. I'm glad I didn't get pulled over for DUI. It's fun to camp, but it can be dangerous to camp in very remote places. Since then, I've driven past that metal fence, but it's always been there. Still, I would never go back that way. When I was younger, between the ages of 12 and 16, I was a scout, and one of our favorite places to camp was Larch Hill in the Wicklow Mountains. The camp was surrounded by dense forests and hills, making it beautiful, but a bit eerie at night. Around the campfire, scout leaders used to tell us scary stories. One of the most popular was about the Lady of Larch Hill, a ghostly figure who, according to them, roamed the woods at night searching for something or someone. Back then, I didn't believe much in those stories. I thought they were just made-up tales to scare us. But during one particular trip, something happened that made me reconsider. At Larch Hill, upon arriving at the camp, you could park in a large dirt area near the entrance. To the right, there was a welcome center and some bathrooms. From there, a gravel path stretched forward, connecting two open fields where tents were usually set up. On this trip, our group settled in the farthest field. At night, the only lighting came from the parking area and the bathrooms. Beyond that, it was total darkness. Our group set up our tents near the tree line at the lower part of the field, and my best friend and I shared a tent. That night, after a small argument we had earlier, I decided to ask her to go to the bathroom with me to make peace. I didn't want to walk alone in the absolute darkness. She agreed, though she walked a few steps ahead in silence. As we walked, we didn't use flashlights, relying instead on the dim light coming from the dining area. I kept my eyes on the ground to avoid tripping over tree roots or any camping gear that might have been left out for the next morning. Suddenly, I noticed something strange. A girl's shadow was walking close to me, about 3 feet behind me to my left. At first, I thought one of the other girls had decided to join us because she was also afraid to go to the bathroom alone at night. But when I turned around to look, there was no one there. However, the shadow was still clearly projected on the ground when I looked back. It was unmistakable. The outline showed a girl's long hair and what looked like a dress. The most unsettling part was the source of the light. That night was cloudy, with no visible moon or stars, and the dim lighting from the dining area wasn't strong enough to cast such defined shadows. My shadow and my friend's shadow stretched forward, towards 10 o'clock. But that other shadow seemed to come from a completely different direction, as if it had its own light source. A chill ran down my body. Unable to think clearly, I hurried to catch up with my friend. Neither of us said a word as we walked. Only the crunch of our footsteps and the whisper of leaves in the trees could be heard. The shadow didn't reappear, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. When we reached the bathrooms, I locked myself in a stall and stayed there still for a few moments, doing nothing. I didn't leave until I heard my friend flush and open her stall. While washing my hands, I avoided looking in the mirror. I was afraid of seeing something I didn't want to see. We then walked back to our tent in silence, and I went straight into my sleeping bag without saying a word. I was to talk, but I could hear my friend moving. That night, I hardly slept because I was like stuck thinking about what had happened and whether I had seen a ghost. To this day, when someone asks me if I've ever had any supernatural experiences, I always think back to that night and the strange shadow that followed me at Larch Hill. I hiked in a state park that I visit often a few months ago. I've been there a lot of times and nothing strange has ever happened. The forest is almost 2,000 acres big, and there are long, twisting paths through the thick, wild trees. You can park in 2 lots, one on the east side and one on the west. However, they are not very close to each other. That day, I went to the eastern parking lot and was glad to see that it was empty. My car was also the only one there. That's not odd. The park is quiet and out of the way, so not many people go there. One reason I like going there is because of that. In the woods, I like to go off the main path and find places that look like they haven't been touched by people or are very far from any structures that people have built. It felt like any other day. I took my dog on a trail we had been on before. I liked the peace and quiet. We went into the woods for about 6 miles until we reached a spot where the trail crossed a stream. I chose to leave the trail and follow the river deeper into the bush because I liked the sound of the water moving. We moved farther into the woods, away from any signs of the trail. The air felt cool as we did. It took us about 3 more miles to walk along the riverbank, enjoying being in the middle of nature. While I was walking, I heard what sounded like a very far-away talk between 2 people. When I stopped to listen, there was silence around me, but I could still make out the faint sound of 2 people talking. I thought it might be an animal because it was so quiet. After that, I thought there was no reason for anyone to be out there. It didn't make sense. The sound slowly went away, so I didn't pay attention to it and kept going. The waterway was in a deep valley surrounded by steep hills on both sides. To get a better view of the area, I chose to climb the hill on the right and then turn around. That made my walk about 16 miles long. The climb was hard, and my dog followed me the whole way. It was a steep hill. I was getting tireder as I went up. It felt like a long time, but I finally got to the top and found a flat area. I saw a big rock and sat down to catch my breath and let my dog rest too. Out of the blue, I heard 2 people talking while I was sitting there with my dog in great quiet, but I couldn't understand a word of it. The sounds came from around the corner, close to the cliff, right next to me. What scared me was that I was there to get away from people as much as possible. Now keep in mind that I was in a state forest that was far away and had a parking lot with no other cars. It's only possible to get there by car. I didn't know of any other way. I had gone off the path and into the woods, then climbed a very steep hill to a high point. Then, this happened. Also, spring had just begun, and there was at least a foot of dead leaves and sticks on the ground. They should have been able to hear me coming through the trees because I would have made a lot of noise, like a freight train. I would have also been able to hear any other sounds. But I didn't hear anything. The voices began. After about a minute, they went quiet. I was really scared by that point, so I chose to leave right away. But that's not the end of it. When I got back to the riverbank and started walking back toward the trail I had left behind, I heard the 2 voices again. This time, they were making strange noises that sounded like wolves. and could be heard in the trees behind me. A chill went down my spine as I heard them cry and howl over and over again for a long time. When I finally got back to the trail, I could still hear those scary sounds further away. When I finally got to my car with my dog, we quickly left the area. Still, there were no other cars in the parking lot or anywhere else nearby. Based on what I saw, it doesn't seem likely that there were two people where I was. But I'm not saying it's impossible. It could have been a very skilled hunter who had been moving through the woods for a while, but what was wrong with them? Why did they not make any more noise, and why didn't they seem to hear me coming even though they saw me?